Everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric, and we got a brand new retrospective starting today that we're calling The History of the Dead. I'm going to be doing a video on every single mainline and offshoot House of the Dead game ever made, talking about how Sega developed the games and how they brought zombies back to the forefront. Because when I say this series changed the face of gaming moving forward, I 100% mean it. This game and Resident Evil repopularized zombies in the video game genre, and everything has never been the same since. It is one of my favorite franchises of all time in gaming, and I can't wait to talk about how this first game, The House of the Dead, launched an entire series for Sega that we still have today. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like, subscribe, that notification bell, it will definitely help us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But this is where it all starts. The House of the Dead starts right here as that car drives in to the front gate of the Curian Mansion. I remember when I first played this game, I was at the Great Escape in Glens Falls, New York, a theme park, and as opposed to playing rides, I wanted to go into the arcades. A brand new cabinet I'd never seen before was sitting there, and it was The House of the Dead, and I played it from start to finish with all of my allowance money my parents let me spend that day. From that day forward, I have loved this franchise. I own a lot of original arcade PCBs for the series, and I play it all of the time. But this is where it all begins, and I just absolutely love this game for its presentation. The developers are basically trying to make a Western-feeling horror game that involved zombies, and shockingly, this game was made in just a little over a year. If you believe the internet, it's about 14 months from start to finish, and it runs on the Virtual Cop engine. Something that Sega was very familiar with was light gun games, because while this is the first House of the Dead game, they had done other horror light gun games like Laser Ghost and Alien 3 The Gun. So even though this is where the franchise starts, Sega had a lot of history in the actual arcades dealing with horror games. They don't do as much horror at home, but in the arcades they're 100% fond of it, and that is always a great thing. But honestly, Resident Evil is always going to get the credit for repopularizing zombies in the video game format, bringing us things like Dead Rising and the like. But this cabinet was hugely influential, and it was a massive hit for Sega. If you walk into any arcade today, you're probably going to see a House of the Dead cabinet, maybe number 1, maybe number 2. It's like a coin flip of whether or not they're going to have one. This was a massive success for Sega, and it shows, but mechanically and gameplay wise, this is absolutely everything you want in a light gun shooter. The gameplay is solid, the music is spectacular, the graphics for Model 2 are amazing. It just has absolutely everything I crave when it comes to a series, and it's so much fun to be able to bring this to you and talk about it. And in just a moment, I'm going to be talking about the prototype ROM of House of the Dead, because that does exist. So let's move over. It's always fun to talk about how games change. And it is incredible that we get these prototype releases for the original House of the Dead and House of the Dead 2 on Naomi, because you can see just how these games evolved. This is the intro screen to the prototype, and it is much less ornate. It has a lot less cuts than the actual released game. And interestingly enough, as we come up here to get our first close-up look of the Curian Mansion, you're going to see the title of the game, and something is going to be missing. It is The House of Dead. I do not know if that's an error or if that was the original name, but of course, with Japanese developers, maybe that language just did escape them. And there is a decent amount of differences in the ROM. I would say this feels like 80 to 85% complete, and you'll notice right off the top that they adjusted a lot of the colors and shadows in the released ROM versus the prototype. You can see in that ceiling, everything is a lot brighter on the original version, and that's actually to the game's detriment. It doesn't have that same horror vibe, so a lot of the changes, while cosmetic, were 100% warranted. I'm so glad Sega decided to do that, because I always love looking at a prototype version of a game compared to the original, and at least in level 1 here, there are some fundamental changes in the story and character design as well. But there is Sophie, a real blink and you'll miss her character unless you get a bad ending, because she's going to very shortly just get yeeted straight into that wall, and that is all you see of her. But you'll see here Chariot is named after a tarot card, and that is a naming convention in the entire game. And interestingly, this is the only character in the game that was actually done via motion capture. All of the other bosses were animated by hand, probably because this is the only human character. But there's fundamental story changes in the game between the prototype ROM and the finished one, so go ahead and listen for 35 seconds so you can hear what happened.
Sophie!
You must stop Curian, or else something terrible will happen.
Sophie!
losing her right there before him, he shot not only to complete his mission, but for her revenge.
Just a complete change in that first cutscene. Interestingly enough, in the prototype ROM as well, Sega's developers had not quite gotten to the tarot card naming convention of the bosses, because Chariot here, after he hits Sophie, is actually Bacchus, the god of wine, and that is a fundamental change. Other small additions are going to be the title cards. It's very quick, I don't have a lot to cut there, but it is yellow versus white, and again, a lot of the colors are just totally different, and that's the biggest change between the two outside of story perspective, is that they didn't quite get the art style perfect yet, in my opinion. But honestly, going back to the mechanics of this game and just how it looks, this is an iconic release. There's absolutely no criticism I can level against this game. Now, I am definitely 100% biased because I love the House of the Dead franchise and pretty much everything Sega did on the Model 2 and Model 3. But just scenes like this hallway here with that crimson red carpet, with all of this darkness, with little bits of glowing light from those alcoves, there is an entire vibe in this game that is unmatched by the rest of the series. I do think that Sega got it best in the first game in the franchise, so leave me a comment down below and tell me what you think. I think that the entire series is spectacular, don't get me wrong, but for my money, the original is still going to be the best. I just love the Curian Mansion, how it's this gothic horror setting with all of these ornate tapestries on the walls, that crimson red tablecloth, the stained glass. Every single inch of this game has been designed from an art perspective to make it feel like you're in a very classic horror setting. Even when you get down to the lab areas, it still continues that. And be very mindful of that zombie throwing a human. We're going to get to that in just a few minutes when we talk about some of the games that this game actually did inspire, because this brought zombies back to the forefront, I think a little bit even more so than Resident Evil, but that is just me. But one of the other aspects of this game that I think Sega 100% absolutely nailed, 10 out of 10 perfect, is the soundtrack. So go ahead and listen for like 45 seconds, come back and talk more about the history of the dead.
Thank you.
It's just an absolutely iconic soundtrack that mixes kind of jazzy fusion with horror vibes, and it is spectacular. But this game borrows from so many film tropes, the classic haunted house, the George A. Romero style zombie, as well as a lot of the biomechanical experiments. But talking about games that the House of the Dead inspired, one of my favorite games of all time, Evil Knight on the 3DO M2 arcade hardware, is definitely a clone or slight ripoff of the House of the Dead. But that's how much the House of the Dead actually inspired other games in the zeitgeist of gaming. It brought zombies back. Capcom did it for the home console market, and Sega did it for the arcades. But again, a human above a head being thrown at you, totally something that happened in the House of the Dead. They got carried into other games as well. Even stuff like the breakable bookcases and things hiding behind that. This is stuff that Sega invented in the House of the Dead that would be carried on to other games. And it's just such a testament to how well they did off the start. The other games and other creators were inspired by them. And throughout this entire series, I'm going to talk about other games that have a connection to the House of the Dead, even if they were not made by Sega. But there's just something so special about this title, not just because of its time and place, but because of what it did. In arcades, this looked spectacular. It was something that we would never see in home consoles for a long time. It felt like magic when you were playing this game, seeing all these new characters that would carry into successive entries in the franchise, because Sega loves to call back to games and play around with them. Like Hanged Man here, variations of him will show up in other games. And again, it's just an iconic boss. I love that full moon in the background, a moon that is way too big for real life, but it is such a vibe in a tone. You can't help but absolutely love it. And the boss fights are all spectacular as well. Each one has its own set of criteria you need to meet, neat and another flow of the gameplay. And that's what this game does so well, is it constantly changes the gameplay flow up to see what's going on and to give you another challenge, because sometimes you're just shooting at targets that are directly in front of you, and sometimes the game makes you really aim and kind of wait for things to happen. It's got a nice sense of suspense because you don't know where Hanged Man is coming from there, and that is just so much fun. Now interestingly, as we play this entire game, you will see that no female zombies show up, and that's because the developers of the game were concerned about actually shooting female zombies. They thought that they looked more like elderly women, and they pulled that from the series, and it is very rare that you will see a female zombie in the entire game. It's another really interesting development fact that I'd love to talk about. But let's move on to the third chapter, Truth, and this is where we get further into the underlying structure of the mansion. And if this doesn't seem familiar, think about the Spencer Mansion in Resident Evil, because just like that, the Curian Mansion starts as an ornate estate house, and underneath is all of this lab work. There's other games that are very similar to this as well, stuff like Beastbuster's Second Nightmare that takes place in a hospital, but I will be showing that off in a different House of the Dead retrospective episode because I think it has more ties to that than this. But this has always been a trope of this type of film or game. There's always the house and there's always what's underneath it. Even the Resident Evil movies use that exact same concept of all of the underlying structure, that sense of fear of, even if you know what you think you see, a house that is very innocuous, there could be something going on inside of it that you have absolutely no idea about, that could be absolutely horror-ridden if you just knew what was going on. And I love that they do that here, especially with the saving of the hostages. That's definitely not something the game invented, but I love the stakes of it. You can open that door and let her out, but you're going to have to fight 3 high-powered zombies, and you need to decide whether or not that is worth it for you. Additionally, there are all the branching pathways in this game. There are so many different routes to take, some easier, some harder, and you kind of identify what your preferred route is. It might not be the easiest one, it might be the one that you just like the level structure of the most. This game gives you a lot of freedom for being an on-rail shooter, and I love that Sega did that. But another thing just to talk about is how good the zombie design is. All of the destructible limbs, you can shoot holes through torsos and explode heads. It is a violent game, and interestingly, they added in different colors of blood for different markets. They knew they'd never get away with red blood for the German market, and that was a smart move. Because as you see throughout this retrospective, the violence is going to get tamer and tamer until we get to Scarlet Dawn. But this game is the most violent of them all. All of the destructible limbs, all of the blood, all the exploding heads, the holes in torsos. This drives home the full horror aspect of the game, and I am slightly disappointed that Sega decided to diminish that over time, because while Scarlet Dawn is an incredible game, I hate that my zombies just kind of fade out of existence. Because right here, that big torso hole with exposed ribs, it just really makes you feel like you are shooting the undead and you are tearing them apart limb from limb. It's just such a spectacular feeling, and I wish the later games kept that in as well. But setting wise, this giant lava pit down here is 100% incredible, and all of the enemy designs, they kind of look like their skin is burnt in this area. It is such a great look. But the best part is the voice acting. Listen to this cutscene and I'll be right back.
Curious.
I must compliment you. I didn't think you could make it this far. However, this is it. Let's see how good you really are.
It's just absolutely cheesy dialogue done in the worst way possible, but that's become part and parcel of this series, because even when you get to Scarlet Dawn, an era in which they could have had any voice acting they wanted, they still went with a really hammy dialogue. But taking a look at this boss here, it's interesting how themes repeat in this game, because if we go to the House of the Dead 4 with the lovers, we get another spider boss. It is different, but so many of the different looks and feels and tropes of this game get put into successive entries, and I love that when you play a new House of the Dead game, you can immediately identify what is old and what is new, and they're never repurposing territory. They're always just lovingly calling back to a moment that maybe you remember from a past entry, because Sega puts a ton of fan service into each of the House of the Dead games, and a lot of that fan service here comes from the original game in the series. And now that that spider is dead, I do not like spiders, I'm always happy to kill him, we can move on to the last level in the game. And again, it's just spectacular. The entire entire journey through the Curian Mansion is so good, and in each successive game there's going to be another mad doctor or scientist or businessman who is trying to right the wrongs of the world, because every antagonist in this game is trying to change human evolution, or they think that humans have gone beyond their native means and they need to be culled back like any other species. It's a very interesting critique and talk about the actual human condition, and it's something that you wouldn't expect out of a Sega arcade game. I'm not saying it's done in a way that's the most poignant, but if you do read between the lines, you will understand why these people are trying to do what they do. Now in the last level you do get a couple bosses recycled, and it does feel ever so slightly like Sega was trying to artificially elongate the end game, but these bosses are so good that seeing them a second time really doesn't bother me that much whatsoever. You get through them and you get to move on to the final area of the game, and honestly Hangman here, such a great boss. Shooting him twice and killing him twice is something that I will never complain about having to do. But even with the few boss refights, we still get a lot of level here in this corridor with all of these electrical bolts coming through and all of some of the best designed enemies in the game popping out in pairs. It's just one last look at how incredible this game was before you get to the final boss battle. And again, I cannot stress how influential and incredible this game was on release. This was a massive hit for Sega, and zombies became popular again in popular culture because of this game. Everyone who was alive in this era played The House of the Dead. Now I could have shown footage from the Saturn port, but because the Model 2 version emulates so well, that is the version I recommend you play. You can play the Saturn port, it is quite good, it's just very ugly, but definitely if you have a choice, play the Model 2 original, because this is what the game looks like to me. And again, when this game came out, I had never seen anything this graphically advanced. It felt like playing the future, both in graphics and in tone, because games usually weren't this serious and mature. I was playing stuff like platformers, so playing something like The House of the Dead just felt spectacular. And getting to this first final boss here with the magician, it is an iconic design. Those like muscle tendrils beating like a heart on his body are spectacular, and obviously Curian could not control his own projects, trying to change the DNA of man to create something new. It's that classic horror trope of nobody can control nature, because that is what Curian's trying to do here, to control evolution and nature in and of itself, and that is always a fool's errand. But the magician here with almost that Harlequin style mask on is just such an iconic design. This is my favorite final boss in the entire House of the Dead franchise, and trust me, there's a lot of incredible final bosses, but for my money the magician takes the cake on his first outing, and it is a hard fight. But the challenge in this game is always fair. If you miss a shot, it's because you missed it. If you get hit, it's because you weren't playing well enough. This is not a cheap game by any stretch of the imagination. It's not there to steal your quarters. And if for some reason you do want to buy an original arcade PCB, do keep in mind that while they're not that expensive, it only works on a medium resolution cabinet, so you have to have a medium resolution monitor. You can't play it in 15 kilohertz, you can't play it in 31 kilohertz, you gotta have that 24. But even these orbs shooting up into the sky, it's just so memorable, and it's shocking to me that Sega was able to make this game in around 14 months. They changed the course of gaming history and zombie history in 14 months. What did you do in the last 14 months? I mean, I made some videos, but I didn't change popular culture, and the idea that Sega was that influential is just so spectacular. This is a game that I have such incredible memories of, playing the arcade original in an amusement park, buying a Sega Saturn just to play this game at home as a kid, having every single mainline entry in my collection and loving to play them all the time. It all starts here the Curian Mansion with the original game, and I even love the ending. It is so cheesy. And interestingly, as we get into later games in this series, I'm going to be doing the videos in release order, but the actual storyline chronologically does not take place in the same structure as the numbered entries. It definitely bounces around, and a lot of these characters like Rogan and G, you'll be seeing in different games alongside new characters, but the entire lore of the House of the Dead kicks off here. Everything that we've been playing for decades got its start in this one game, and that is just spectacular. I've been playing this series my entire life, and every single time a new game comes out, I'm going to find an arcade cabinet, I'm going to bring my quarters, and I'm going to put as much money into it as it takes to see the ending. And I even love the ending of this game where you have this slow stroll back through the Curian Mansion on the route that you took to get here, seeing all of the structure one last time. It's a very elegant and relaxing way to end a game that was nothing but action-packed from start to finish. And that's the thing, this game does not take very long to beat, especially if you're on emulation or you need to worry about money. But the amount of time you spent with it, in my opinion, is sheer perfection. Every single moment is curated. Every single room, every single level has such design and intent behind it that it feels like a living, breathing place, even if everything inside of it, outside of Curian, is the undead. It's just a special game, and these games do not come around all that often, but I would say as far as the history of gaming is concerned, The House of the Dead is one of the 10 most influential video games ever made. But go ahead and comment down below and leave me a list of what you think would be the 10 most influential games, or even the one you think influenced gaming the most, because I would be very curious. But throughout the next 10 weeks, we're going to have 10 more episodes on The House of the Dead in the History of the Dead retrospective. But this is what kicks it off, the first game in the series, the first video in the series, and it is absolute perfection. I'll see you guys next time. Hope you enjoyed the video. Bye-bye.